My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 32 and just trying to find my place in the family. I hoped this year would be different, that I'd finally be seen, but when I arrived at the will reading, they still acted like I didn't exist. They whispered, laughed, and made sure I was the last to be noticed. Then something happened that changed everything, but they never saw it coming. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the conference room was how warm it was compared to the sharp December air outside. Warm, but not welcoming. The kind of heat that clings to polished oak and heavy wool coats, not to people. I stood for a moment in the doorway, adjusting my scarf, letting my eyes sweep the long table. My parents were already there, seated close to the head as if by right, their postures straight, voices carrying just enough to be heard by the far end of the room. Claire leaned toward a cousin, whispering something that made both of them smile. She didn't look up when I entered. I slid my bag off my shoulder, feeling the weight of a birthday card still tucked inside, unopened. Thomas was mid-story about a ski trip in Aspen. Everyone was there, he said, glancing around the table. The way his eyes skimmed past me was deliberate. Evelyn's pearl earrings caught the overhead light as she tilted her head toward him, adding, "It really was perfect." My chair was near the far window, the only one open. The air there was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of snow drifting in through the narrow crack where the glass didn't quite meet the frame. I pulled out the chair quietly, the scrape against the floor lost under the hum of conversation. No one paused to greet me. I sat smoothing the crease in my sleeve, my eyes drifting to the far end, where Charles Whitmore, the family's lawyer, arranged his notes with the care of someone who had been doing this for decades. Beside his briefcase was a cream envelope sealed with wax. From here, I could just make out the first letter of my name. Thomas's laugh cut through the room again. "She wasn't even there," he said, turning to the uncle beside him. A few smirks followed, quick and quiet, but loud enough if you knew to listen. Evelyn's eyes flicked to me, then away, like she'd checked the weather and found it uninteresting. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. My nails were short, neat, bare of polish. The sleeve of my coat brushed against the wood as I shifted the fabric, whispering in the silence between their jokes. Outside, a bus rumbled past, its sound dulled through the glass. Inside, every small movement seemed amplified, the clink of a spoon against a mug, when Thomas reached for more coffee, the faint rustle of paper, as Claire adjusted her notes from the last board meeting I hadn't been invited to attend. I let my gaze travel to the family portraits on the wall. My grandfather, tall and unsmiling in black and white. Claire and Thomas in a photo from last Christmas, the one I'd only seen in the annual newsletter. I wasn't in any of them. Charles glanced at me once, almost imperceptibly, before returning to his papers. His hands moved with practiced precision, stacking documents, uncapping a pen. The envelope with my name stayed in place untouched. The conversation at the head of the table shifted to the perfect dinner after the reading. "Everyone's coming," Evelyn said, and Claire added, "Of course it wouldn't be the same without the whole family." The words slid past me like water over stone. I reached for my glass of water, the cold seeping into my fingertips. The ice had nearly melted, leaving faint rings on the coaster. From here I could see the steady rise and fall of my father's shoulders as he laughed again, and I wondered if he had any idea how much the sound carried. My seat by the window felt like its own country part of the room, but apart from it. The chatter seemed to bounce off an invisible wall before it reached me. I watched them in the reflection on the glass, their gestures, the tilt of their heads toward one another, the way Claire's hand rested lightly on Evelyn's arm when she leaned in to speak. The envelope stayed in my peripheral vision, a quiet presence between me and the polished world at the other end of the table. Charles checked his watch and lifted a hand for quiet, but the room wasn't ready to hand it over. My aunt was finishing a story about flight delays. My father added a punchline about people who can't manage their time. Laughter spilled neat and controlled, like the sound of silverware placed just so. I adjusted my chair a fraction, aligning its edge with the seam in the carpet. No one noticed. A draft slipped through the window at my elbow, brushing the fringe of my scarf. I pressed the pane with 2 fingers. It gave a reluctant tremor and kept breathing cold. Across the table, Evelyn smoothed the front of her blazer, the motion crisp enough to make the bracelet at her wrist catch the light. It was the same bracelet she'd gifted Claire at 16, the year she'd said presence matters. I could still remember the clasp clicking shut while I stood beside them holding an empty plate. Claire glanced at her phone, then at me and offered a small smile that didn't quite land. "You found the building okay?" she asked, voice pitched for the middle of the table, "Not my corner." "I did?" I said. "That's good," Thomas added, not looking my way. "Parking's a mess if you're late." Someone near him chuckled. I folded the napkin by my water glass into a narrow strip and set it back perfectly squared. A cousin leaned over to whisper names of beneficiaries, rumors about the Vermont place who might get the lake boat. When the whisper reached its basically already decided, a few heads nodded as if a verdict had been read. Charles cleared his throat again a little more firmly. This time the sound stepped through the chatter. He didn't speak yet. He lined up the pens, aligned a stack of documents with the folder's edge, and let the weight of order do the asking. The conversations thinned. "Thank you for being here," he said. His voice carried in a way that didn't need to be loud. "We'll begin shortly." The words drifted to my end of the table and settled clean as snow. Thomas seized the last seconds. "Before we start," he said, "just want to say Dad would have loved seeing everyone together." His gaze skimmed the length of the table, then floated a beat past the window, where my reflection sat. Everyone who was there for him. Evelyn's lips tipped into a soft, polished curve. Claire put a hand on her shoulder, a tableau practiced over years of banquets and benefit dinners. Chairs shifted, a spoon tapped porcelain and went still. I looked at the glossy table surface where overhead light formed a perfect ring around the water carafe. My face hovered at the edge of that halo present and almost not. Charles took his seat. The briefcase lock clicked. The sound was small, but it tidied the air. He drew out the cream envelope and placed it, not with the rest but to his right on its own. From where I sat, the wax seal was a muted red subtle, not the theatrical kind, and the curve of a letter pressed into it. R. I traced it without touching. "Coffee," a paralegal asked softly from behind me, the tray steady in her hands. "Thank you," I said, and took the cup. The heat pooled in my palm. I did not add cream. I didn't trust my hand to pour and not show something I refused to perform. Across the table, Thomas resumed the Aspen story for the benefit of a late-arriving uncle. "Everyone was there," he said again, and the words landed like thumbtacks, small, invisible, hard to remove. Evelyn added all of us and turned her face to Claire. The room understood the script. I let my eyes go to the photographs on the wall, grandfather in that stern, formal portrait, the company's first storefront, a ribbon cutting with faces younger than they felt. There was a space between two frames where a hook waited with nothing on it, a quiet gap, the length of a breath. I held it a second longer than I needed to. "Phones on silent, please," Charles said. A scatter of taps and swipes answered. Claire set hers face down, then flipped it again when a notification lit the glass. The vibration was soft, like a bee in a paper cup, and then gone. Evelyn finally looked my way. It was a polite glance, the kind you give a stranger who has asked for the time. "You're wearing black," she said. "That's good." "It's a reading," I said. It felt right. She nodded as if I'd passed an exam with a single correct answer. Her attention returned to the head of the table. Thomas leaned back with the satisfaction of a man who likes the chair he chose. A cousin whispered, "Do they still do those old-fashioned seals?" And someone else whispered back, "Only for theatrics." Charles's hand rested lightly on the envelope, not possessive, just certain, the way you steady a page before writing your name. The paralegal collected empties. My cup stayed full. I held it as if it were part of the furniture of my place chair pane cup view. Snow began to stipple the black glass of the neighboring building. On the street below, a taxi light blinked in and out under the lip of the awning. Another minute, and the city would forget to be gray. "Are we ready?" Charles asked. Several voices answered yes. Others offered the softer assent of posture, spines straightened, elbows left the table, hands folded. The room poured itself into a shape. I set my cup down. The saucer caught it without sound. Thomas said, "Let's." He smiled at no one in particular. "Long time coming. I'll move through the items as written," Charles said. "If there are questions, we'll address them at the end." He didn't look at me when he said at the end. He looked at the room. It was generous of him the way he refused to separate me from the group, at least with his eyes. My birthday card pressed against the inside seam of my bag, the corner of its envelope blunted from bumping against keys. I didn't take it out. I wanted it to stay untouched by this air. The ink inside would be steady and kind. That kind of ink doesn't belong at tables like this. The list began. It was clean and unadorned. To this person, an item. To that person, an account. To a foundation, a donation. Names rose and sat back down. Hands touched arms. Someone sniffed, and I couldn't tell if it was emotion or allergies. The room settled into the rhythm of being looked at and found worthy. My name didn't come early. It rarely does. Between items, Charles shifted a smaller stack closer. The cream envelope didn't join it. It waited quiet as a footpath under snow. Evelyn twisted her ring once-twice. Thomas cracked a knuckle and then seemed to remember people were watching. Claire pressed her lips together in a way that made them look careful. The paralegal noted something with a soft scratch of pen and ink. The scratch feathered the air and disappeared. I kept my eyes on Charles's hands. They were steady, sun-spotted, competent hands that knew when to hold and when to let go. The kind of hands that could anchor a room without raising a voice. The window gave another cold breath. I didn't move my chair. On the table, a single droplet of condensation rolled off the carafe and made a silver path toward me, thin as thread. It stopped a palm's width away and held its shape, waiting for a small decision that would take it the rest of the way. I let it be. Charles turned a page. He paused, not a stumble, a space. The room leaned forward by a collective inch, a flock pivoting mid-air without speaking. Somewhere behind me, a spoon touched a cup and was set down. No clink this time, just the whisper of china meeting wood. The envelope stayed where it was, the wax seal and uncomplicated truth closed until it wasn't. I measured the breath I had left before the room would change and used it to smooth the napkin one more time, edge to edge, as if neatness could hold the shape of a moment just a little longer. The room moved through names and numbers, each one received with a murmur, a nod, or the stillness of someone masking calculation. I sat within it like a page that hadn't been turned yet. My place at the table was neither hidden nor central, an angle that let me see without being asked to speak. Charles read with the same even pace, his voice brushing over details that might have stung if they belonged to me. They didn't. Not yet. A cousin laughed quietly when her name came with a vacation cabin. Someone squeezed her hand in congratulations. The sound of fabric against fabric was louder than my own breath. Thomas's foot tapped under the table, quick and light, a drummer keeping time for a song only he knew. Evelyn leaned toward him once, whispering something that drew the ghost of a smile to his mouth. Claire kept her eyes ahead, as if watching the finish line of a race she'd trained for all her life. When my name finally came, it arrived without pause. To Rachel, Morgan. Charles said $10. His delivery was clean, as if it were just another fact in a list of weather reports. No one gasped. The laugh began in Thomas, a short exhale, not loud but bright enough for others to catch. Evelyn's mouth opened in a shape of polite disbelief that didn't quite hide its satisfaction. A few shoulders lifted in silent mirth. I kept my gaze on the table's surface, watching the reflection of the chandelier tremble faintly in my water glass. The ice inside shifted once, then settled again. I reached for it, drank, and set it down without a sound. Claire adjusted the pearl at her ear. "That's symbolic," she said, half to the room, half to herself. No one contradicted her. The air was warm enough to carry a scent of coffee and old paper. I let it pass. Charles moved on to the next name without looking in my direction. The envelope with the wax seal remained at his right, untouched. Its presence was quiet but firm, like a shadow in a corner you keep meaning to investigate. The rest of the list closed quickly. Applause scattered in polite bursts. Chairs shifted back. Conversations swelled to fill the space the reading had kept contained. Thomas stood clapping Charles on the shoulder. Evelyn gathered her handbag with the elegance of someone who has never needed to rush. Claire's phone lit again and she tilted it away from me. I stayed seated a moment longer, letting the room walk around me. From this angle I could see the snow falling harder now, each flake catching the streetlight before vanishing into the darker space below. My fingers rested on the edge of the table light enough to lift without anyone noticing. Charles glanced at me, then not long, not heavy, but enough to make me aware of the envelope again. He placed a hand over it, not to hide it, but as though it was waiting for the right time. I gave him the smallest nod, one that could be mistaken for a thank you or a simple goodbye. Either would be true. The chatter swelled. Someone laughed near the door. I rose, gathering my scarf, and felt the room contract slightly as if my leaving shifted the air. No one stopped me. That was fine. The elevator doors were polished enough to hold my reflection faint and double. As they closed, the sound of the room above thinned to nothing. I stood alone in the mirrored box, the ghost of the wax seal still clear in my mind, a quiet mark unopened, carrying something that didn't belong to the laughter. Not yet. The winter storm had settled in overnight, burying the city in a layer of white so thick that the streets seemed quieter than usual. I woke to the muted hum of the radiator and the faint rattle of wind against my window. The $10 check still sat on my kitchen counter where I'd left it, its presence neither demanding attention nor allowing me to forget. I made coffee the way I always did, 2 scoops water just off the boil, while the memory of yesterday replayed in fragments. Thomas's smirk, Evelyn's sidelong glance, Claire's careful silence. The words $10 rolling off Charles's tongue with the weight of something deliberately light. The envelope, though, that stayed with me more than any of their expressions. The way Charles's hand rested on it, how he didn't rush to open it, and how no one asked. As if its contents were meant for a quieter stage. By mid-morning, my phone had chimed 3 times. A text from Evelyn in the family group chat, lovely to see everyone yesterday. Claire had added a string of heart emojis. Thomas sent a picture of the snow piling up on his porch with the caption, "Guess we'll be stuck inside for a while." No one mentioned the reading. I put on my coat and walked to the small market on the corner, boots crunching in the fresh snow. The shop owner, Mrs. Green, gave me her usual nod from behind the counter. We talked about the storm, about how it reminded her of the winter her roof caved in, and then she asked almost in passing if my family had been in town for the holiday. I told her yes, that we'd had a gathering, and left it at that. On the way back, I passed the old library. Its steps were slick, but the inside glowed with yellow light. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The warmth and smell of paper greeted me instantly. Charles was there in the corner, speaking quietly with the librarian. He saw me before I could decide whether to approach. "Rachel," he said, his voice as even as it had been yesterday. "Do you have a minute?" We sat at a table near the window. Outside, the snow blurred everything beyond a few feet. He reached into his bag and placed the wax-sealed envelope between us. "This was part of your father's instructions," he said. "He wanted you to open it privately. I was to give it to you after the reading." I ran my fingers over the seal, tracing its edges. "Any idea what's inside?" He shook his head. "Only that it's not a legal document. More personal, I think." I didn't open it there. Instead, I slid it into my coat pocket, thanked him, and left. Back home, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it while the kettle whistled. The seal caught the light, a faint shimmer on its surface. I didn't break it. Not yet. That evening, my phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was careful, as if she'd rehearsed. "Rachel, we're having dinner tomorrow at Mom's. Just the family. You should come." The invitation was unexpected, but not entirely unwelcome. "All right," I said. "What time? 6? And maybe bring that envelope with you." Her request hung there for a beat too long. I didn't answer directly. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said, and hung up before she could say more. The rest of the night, the envelope sat between me and whatever I tried to do, read, cook, watch the news. Its weight was more in my mind than in my hand, and I wondered how many others were thinking about it too. The next afternoon, the snow had softened the edges of the city, muffling the usual bustle into a low murmur. I stood outside my mother's house, the same house I had grown up in, but hadn't been inside for years. The wreath on the door was fresh, decorated with red berries and silver bells, a cheerful contrast to the cold gray sky. I took a breath, the kind that gathers courage and exhales doubt. The brass key in my coat pocket felt heavier today, a silent promise. When I knocked, the door swung open before I could hesitate. Evelyn's smile was tight, her eyes scanning me quickly as if counting the years I'd been absent. "Rachel," she said, voice measured. "Come in." Inside the house smelled of cinnamon and pine, familiar, but distant like a photograph with faded colors. Claire was already there, seated at the long dining table, her posture relaxed but alert. "Glad you made it," she said, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The table was set for a small group, china plates with silver rims, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier above. The air felt charged with expectations unspoken and heavy. Thomas arrived moments later, his greeting curt but polite. He shook my hand, his grip firm but lacking warmth. "You're on time," he remarked, glancing at his watch. Dinner began with the usual small talk, the weather, the city's traffic, Claire's latest work project. I noticed how Evelyn kept stealing glances toward the envelope, tucked discreetly in my bag. It rested against the leather strap, its presence a quiet thunder under the table. As we ate, Thomas spoke of the upcoming family meeting, emphasizing the importance of unity and shared responsibility. "We need to think about the future," he said, "about who will carry the legacy forward." His eyes locked with Claire's for a brief moment, filled with certainty. I kept my hands folded in my lap, listening but unmoved. The words were familiar, rehearsed, like a script everyone knew except me. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn cleared her throat and said, "Rachel, we were surprised by your presence yesterday. You could have chosen not to come." I looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. "I thought it was important to be here." She smiled, but it was a smile edged with something sharp, reminder or warning, I couldn't tell. "Well, we hope you understand that this family has expectations." Claire chimed in, voice light but firm. "We all have roles to play." I let their words settle a calm beneath the surface. My fingers brushed the envelope in my bag, a tactile anchor. When dessert arrived, a simple tart with fresh berries, Thomas raised his glass. "To family," he said. The others echoed, and I lifted mine too, though my toast was silent. Later, when the plates were cleared, Evelyn looked at me again. About the envelope, she said carefully, "Is there something we should know?" I reached into my bag and placed it on the table. The wax seal caught the candlelight, glowing faintly. The room quieted. "I haven't opened it yet," I said, "but I intend to." Thomas's jaw tightened. Claire's eyes narrowed. Evelyn's hand twitched. Charles had told me to keep the contents private, but I knew once this was out, nothing would be the same. The envelope sat between us, a silent challenge. I glanced at each face around the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and something like fear. I took a breath. This was the moment the quiet began to shift. The following morning, I sat by the window, the envelope unopened on the kitchen table. Light filtered softly through the frost-lined glass, casting fractured patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, the city was waking slowly beneath a blanket of gray. My phone buzzed again, a message from Claire. "Let's talk before tonight." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering, then set it down without replying. There were conversations I wasn't ready to have. Later that day, Charles called. His voice was calm, measured like a steady hand on a rocky path. "Rachel, it's time. The reading isn't over yet. There's one more thing." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That evening, I returned to the law office. The room was quieter than before. A handful of family members had stayed behind, curiosity etched on their faces. Thomas's eyes flicked toward me briefly, then away. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Claire's posture was rigid, controlled. Charles motioned me to the side office. The door closed softly behind us, the sound sharp in the hush. He handed me the envelope. "It's your grandfather's final message." My fingers trembled as I broke the wax seal. Inside were several letters, each written in his neat, deliberate script. I unfolded the first and began to read, "My dearest Rachel, I know this has been a difficult journey for you, but I have watched you with pride, even when others did not. This is my gift to you, not because of your place at the table, but because of the vision you hold. The next pages detailed the establishment of a trust naming me as sole beneficiary with assets far beyond the other's inheritance, a downtown property shares in the family company, and funds earmarked for creative projects. I looked up at Charles, searching for a sign, anything to tell me this wasn't some elaborate mistake. He nodded slowly. Your grandfather made sure you'd have what you need. The rest, well, that's up to you. Returning to the main room, I could feel the weight of every eye. Charles cleared his throat. One final matter, he said. Rachel Morgan is the trustee and primary owner of the Harper Creative Trust. The room went silent. Evelyn's hand faltered as she reached for her necklace. Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching, but no words. Claire blinked, the sheen of surprise breaking through her composure. I stood holding the letters close. My heart beat steadily. No need for words. I placed the documents on the table with a soft thud, the sound sharp in the stillness. That's all I said simply. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the door. The soft scrape of my shoes on the polished floor echoed behind me. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving a quiet stillness that felt like the beginning of something new. The door to the side office closed behind me with a muted click that felt heavier than it should. The low hum of voices from the main room receded, replaced by a quiet so thick it seemed to press against my skin. Charles handed me a thick folder, its cover soft and worn, bearing the Harper family crest embossed in gold. I settled into the leather chair, the scent of aged paper and cedar filling the space. The brass key beside the folder caught the light, gleaming quietly like a secret waiting to be unlocked. I unfolded the letter from my grandfather first. His familiar handwriting carried across the page, every stroke deliberate and full of meaning. Rachel, my dear, I have watched you with a quiet pride that no one else has seen. This trust is not just an inheritance of wealth, but a legacy of vision. Use it to build, not to follow. You see what others overlook. That is your gift. The next pages laid out the terms of the trust, a penthouse studio in the city, the majority stake in the family's creative holdings funds, designated to support artists who, like me, had been overlooked or underestimated. I traced the lines of the document with my finger, letting the weight of the responsibility settle in. It was more than money. It was a chance to reshape the story. Charles watched me silently, his presence steady and reassuring. Your grandfather believed in you, he said softly. This was his final act of faith. Taking a deep breath, I closed the folder and stood the brass key warm in my palm. We returned to the main room together, the door opening to a tableau frozen in time. Faces turned toward us, expressions flickering between disbelief and guarded respect. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. Thomas's fingers clenched at the edge of the table. Claire's eyes searched for a reaction I refused to give. Charles cleared his throat and addressed the room. Rachel Morgan is the sole trustee of the Harper Creative Trust. She holds the majority ownership and is charged with stewarding the family's artistic legacy. The silence that followed was sharp and complete. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of truth hung suspended in the air. I stepped forward, placing the folder on the table with a soft thud that echoed louder than any shout. That is all, I said calmly. Turning toward the door, I felt their eyes follow me, heavy and uncertain. The soft scrape of my shoes on the floor was the only sound as I left the room behind. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet light streets, slick with melting snow. I held the brass key tightly, knowing that a new chapter had just begun, one written not in words, but in actions yet to come. The evening light faded, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of the chandelier. I could feel the weight of all those eyes still on me, even as I moved through the crowd, folder in hand. The sound of whispered conversations floated just beyond reach, full of questions and half-truths. Evelyn stood near the fireplace, her fingers nervously twisting a silver bracelet. Thomas leaned against the mantel, jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the gathering. Claire was close by, her expression unreadable but taut, like a wire pulled too tight. I made my way to the far window where the city lights twinkled through the frosted glass. The brass key in my palm felt cold, but it was steady, like the promise my grandfather had left me. Charles approached quietly. They expected a different outcome, he said softly, but this is the reality. I nodded, the words settling in my mind. This wasn't just about inheritance, it was about recognition, about finally being seen for who I was not, who they wanted me to be. The room began to clear, voices lowering as guests took their leave. I stayed by the window watching the snow melt slowly on the sidewalks below. The soft crunch of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then silence returned. Later, alone in the penthouse studio that bore my name, I placed the folder carefully on the desk. Around me, photographs I had taken over the years lined the walls, stories of forgotten places and overlooked faces. I picked up the brass key and held it against a frame. The metal was cool, unyielding, yet comforting. This was my inheritance, not just the documents, but the vision my grandfather had entrusted to me. Outside, the city's pulse slowed as night deepened. Inside, I felt a quiet fire kindle, steady and sure. I thought of the family I'd left behind, the laughter, the smirks, the whispered dismissals. They had chosen their path, but I had mine. And with that key in my hand, I was ready to open the door. The following days passed in a blur of decisions and quiet moments of reflection. The brass key found its place on a delicate leather cord, resting around my neck like a talisman. It was both a reminder and a promise of legacy, responsibility, and freedom. I visited the penthouse for the first time, stepping into a space both foreign and familiar. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the city skyline, the streets winding beneath a blanket of fresh snow. The air smelled faintly of cedar and aged paper, just like my grandfather's study. The studio was bathed in soft light. My photographs lined the walls, black and white portraits, abandoned storefronts, quiet alleys. Each image told a story of things overlooked, moments missed by the hurried and the blind. This was more than a gallery. It was a declaration. Back at home, the phone stayed silent. No calls from Evelyn or Thomas. Claire's messages remained unread. Their absence was a relief, a clear boundary drawn in the snow outside. At the opening of the Harper Light Studios' inaugural exhibit, invitations had gone out only to a select few trusted friends, critics, and those who understood the power of quiet vision. The room buzzed softly with conversation and appreciation. As guests moved through the space, I watched their faces. Some were surprised, others moved deeply by the images and the stories they held. When a local art critic approached, nodding thoughtfully, I felt a swell of something I hadn't allowed myself before: pride. My family did attend, though late. Evelyn's eyes flickered between curiosity and disbelief. Thomas's stance was guarded and Claire's smile was tight, but their presence was undeniable. I met them at the entrance holding the guest book. I nodded in greeting, no warmth, no anger, just acknowledgement. The final piece in the gallery was a simple display, the $10 check framed beside a photograph of my grandfather gazing out a train window. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the smallest inheritance is the greatest test." I lingered there as the room filled with whispers and soft footsteps. The quiet power of the moment settled over us all. Later, standing alone in the studio, I lit a candle on the desk. The flame flickered in the stillness, casting shadows that danced like ghosts of the past. I thought about the journey, the laughter behind closed doors, the silent battles, the letters unopened. The power to define myself had finally been mine all along. Outside, the city pulsed with life, indifferent to the storm that had passed and the calm that followed. Inside, I embraced the quiet strength of being seen, not by their approval, but by my own. I left the studio door unlocked that night. Some wandered in, curious strangers, students seeking light, maybe even those who had once doubted. They stood before the framed check and the quiet photograph, whispering questions without answers. They didn't need to know the full story, because true legacy isn't found in words spoken or battles won. It's in the silence that follows the space where respect finally settles. And in that quiet, I am more than seen. I am enough.